I used to drive for Uber in a large city. It was my primary source of income. I used to just do it on the side, but when I was fired from my regular job, I started doing it full time. I actually came to prefer it after a while. Sometimes it was entertaining, other times frustrating, but it was always an adventure. One night I picked up a passenger who was clearly drunk. Not unusual at all. His speech was slurred, and he smelled strongly of alcohol. He was probably 35 years old, but he dressed like he was much younger. He had a backwards baseball hat and a tight t-shirt with a gold chain. He just seemed like some high school quarterback, or maybe the president of his fraternity. He radiated arrogance. I put on a smile and greeted him though. I started the car, and we took off. Along the way, he was obnoxious and belligerent. He was yelling and cursing under his breath. I could feel the eyes of the other drivers on us, but I tried to remain calm. It was a long ride, and as we got closer to his destination, he got even worse. I asked him to calm down, trying to be polite, but he was not having any of it. He started to insult me and called me names. I adjusted my dash cam to make sure it was all captured, just in case I needed to defend myself later. He must have not realized that he was being recorded, because he surely would have changed his behavior if he did. Finally, I had enough. I pulled over and turned to him, and I said, "You need to get out of my car, now." He laughed at me.
Who the hell are you to tell me what to do?
I didn't want any trouble, but I also couldn't let him to continue behaving like this. I was polite but firm, and told him to get out of my car again. We argued for a minute or two. He called me some more names, but nothing I hadn't heard before. My mind was made up, and I continued to tell him to get out. We were only a few minutes from his destination, but I wasn't taking any more disrespect. All I said was, "Get out of my car," over and over again, not raising my voice, just repeating. That's when the guy reached into his waistband and pulled out a handgun. I started breathing heavily, and then I put my hands up, as if the guy was a cop or something.
Turn on the car and keep driving,
he said, pointing the gun at me. At least that's what I think he said. His words were very slurred and hard to understand. I didn't move, and I didn't say a word. I had heard stories of Uber drivers being attacked, but I never thought it would happen to me. My mind raced as I tried to figure out a way to handle this. He demanded that I keep driving, threatening to shoot me if I didn't. I turned around and started driving again. I knew that the whole thing was on camera, so all I had to do was get this guy out of my car and then call the police. I stopped at the guy's destination and didn't say a word. He looked around and realized that we were there. Then he opened the door and stumbled out muttering. He left the back door open, but I managed to reach back and close it without getting out of the car. Then I drove for 5 or 10 minutes. I pulled into a church parking lot and called the police. The dispatcher picked up, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could. I told her my name, my location, and that I was an Uber driver with a passenger who had just assaulted me. I gave her the description of the car and the passenger, hoping they'd be able to find me quickly. While I was waiting, I checked my dash cam. It was all there, every second of it. That guy was screwed. The police arrived soon enough, and I gave them a detailed description of what happened. I showed them the footage from my dash cam. They were able to identify the passenger, and they arrested him that night. It was a scary experience, but I'm glad I was able to handle it as well as I did. I learned a lot from that night, including the importance of having a working dash cam. I was at my friend's house last summer. We were having a small party. Most of my other friends that were there were staying over for the night, but I really liked my own bed, so I decided to go home. It was already late, and the house was located in a remote area, so I called an Uber. Nobody else was going my way, so it was just me. I was nervous, but I had taken Ubers by myself before. The driver arrived, and I hopped into the back seat, grateful for the warm interior of the car. The driver was in his mid-30s. He wore a gray jacket and had thick glasses. There was tension in the air as we drove down the dark, deserted road. The driver gave off weird vibes, but I didn't worry about it too much at first. He kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror, and I couldn't help but feel strange. I tried to shake off the feeling, thinking that perhaps he was checking if I was alright. I had been drinking, but I was fine. Maybe he was worried I was going to mess up his car. That's what I thought at the time, anyway. As we drove deeper into the countryside, I noticed that the road was becoming more and more deserted. There were no streetlights, and the only light came from the car. Without any warning, we slowed to a stop and pulled over to the side of the road. The driver got out to check the car, and after a minute or so, he came back and said that it had broken down. The driver was giving off really bad vibes. He kept pacing around the car, and it seemed like he was talking to himself. I asked him if he'd called for help, but he just ignored my question and kept pacing. I was still calm, and I asked him if we could call another Uber or a taxi, but he shook his head and said there was no cell service in the area. I checked my phone and realized that I didn't have any service either. Then the driver stepped in front of the back door where I was sitting. He opened it and started to reach his hand towards me. I pushed it away. He then started making inappropriate comments that I won't repeat. At that point, I knew I had to get out of that car as soon as possible. I was pretty sure that it wasn't even broken down. I thought the driver was faking it to trap me. He may have even chosen the spot because he knew there was no cell service there. I grabbed my bag and quickly got out of the car through the other door. I ran the other way down the road for a while. I didn't know where I was going. I guess I thought I would end up back at my friend's house eventually. I was miles away though. After a minute or two, I noticed a pair of headlights behind me. I turned around to look back, and I saw that it was my driver coming up behind me. He pulled up beside me and tried to convince me to get back in the car. He was playing it off like nothing happened. I screamed for him to leave me alone, but he wouldn't go. After another minute, I saw a few cars passing by up ahead, and I managed to flag down a truck. The driver was a middle-aged man, and he stopped and asked me if I needed help. I told him what happened, and he immediately offered to give me a ride. As soon as the truck stopped, my Uber driver got away. As we went down the road, the truck driver told me that he'd heard of similar incidents in the area. He warned me to be careful about taking Uber rides, especially at night, and especially alone. I was really grateful that he stopped. He was in the right place at the right time. Once I was home, I immediately called the cops. I gave them his information, and they told me they'd look into it. As I lay in bed that night, I felt really lucky to have escaped unharmed. That was a really deserted stretch of road, so I was really lucky to find help when I did. The next day, I received a call from the police. They had found the Uber driver and arrested him. I felt relieved knowing that justice was being served, and that no one else was going to go through what I did. I'm from the UK, and I was living in London at the time. I was in my early 20s, and I lived with some of my friends from uni. My roommate Josh and I were at a bar, having a few drinks with some of our other friends. It was a typical Friday night, and the place was packed with people. We had a great time, but at around midnight, we called it a night. Neither of us had driven to the bar since we were both drinking, so we decided to call an Uber. Josh pulled out his phone and requested the ride. We waited outside for a few minutes, chatting and laughing, until a car pulled up to the curb. I assumed it was our ride and motioned for Josh to follow me. We hopped into the back seat, and the driver took off without a word. It wasn't until a few minutes into the ride that we realized something was off. The driver was taking us in the wrong direction, away from our neighborhood. We exchanged a worried look, but didn't say anything to the driver. Maybe he had a different route in mind, we thought. We then noticed that the car was really dirty, and it smelled like cigarette smoke. The driver's GPS was turned off, and he wasn't following any recognizable maps. I was pretty sure something was off. Josh and I tried to stay calm and quiet, hoping that we were just being paranoid. But then the driver pulled into a deserted parking lot in a rough-looking part of town. He turned around to face us. He had a very serious face with large bags under his eyes. His loose skin drooped from his face like it was melting.
Hand over your wallets and phones.
He growled. Then he held up a knife. Josh and I looked at each other. Each of us hoped the other would know what to do. We were both young without any money to our names. I frantically searched my pockets and handed over my wallet to the driver. Josh did the same, and then we both gave him our phones. The driver then told us to get out. We stumbled onto the pavement, shaken and scared. The car sped off into the night, leaving us stranded in an unfamiliar neighborhood. We looked around trying to figure out where we were. The streets were dark and quiet, with rundown buildings lining the sidewalks. We didn't have any money, and we didn't have any way to call for help. We started walking, hoping to find a main road or a gas station where we could ask for help. But the further we went, the more lost we became. We didn't recognize any of the buildings or landmarks, and there was no one around to ask. We kept walking for another 10 minutes. Then Josh saw a street sign that he recognized. He said he was pretty sure he knew the way back to our apartment. I knew it would be far, but I didn't have any better ideas, so that's what we did. We walked for a long time, over an hour, but eventually we made it back to our neighborhood. We got to our building. Luckily, that piece of crap didn't take our keys. Josh and I collapsed onto our beds as soon as we walked in the front door. It wasn't until the next morning that we called the police. We told them everything that happened the night before, and when they pulled up Uber's records, they found that our driver did not match the description we gave them. That was when we found out that the car we got into was not an Uber at all. It must have just been some guy waiting for a couple of drunk people to rob. When we got in, he simply played along, and the police told us that it was a common scam. Because of that, he was never caught, and we never got our stuff back. We still use Uber, but before we get in, we always make sure it's the right car. There are people like that driver of ours who are out there waiting for people like Josh and I to let our guards down. This all happened a few years ago to me and some of my friends. We had gone out for the night to a few bars downtown. We went to a basketball game earlier, and then had some fun afterwards. We had a really good time for the most part. It was just a typical night out. Eventually, we decided it was time to head home. There were 3 of us that went together, because we all lived pretty close. We called an Uber, and in about 10 minutes, our ride arrived. Our driver was a middle-aged man with a friendly smile. He greeted us warmly, and we all piled into the car. All 3 of us sat in the back, leaving the front passenger seat empty. I could see that Jamie, one of my friends, was pretty drunk, and he started to argue with the driver about the route he was taking. Jamie was never one to back down from a fight, and he was getting more and more belligerent as the ride went on. I knew he could be obnoxious when drinking, but even for him, this was bad. The driver was simply following the directions on his phone. I think Uber knows a little better than some drunk guy about what the best route is. We tried to get Jamie to stop, but it was no use. He was really annoying, but it really wasn't anything beyond that. He wasn't violent or anything. The driver tried to ignore Jamie as well, but eventually he pulled over to the side of the road. We thought he was going to kick us out, but he didn't. He turned around and started yelling at Jamie, who was sitting in the back seat. I could feel the tension in the car rising, and I knew something bad was going to happen. Suddenly, the driver lunged forward and started hitting Jamie. We were all stunned. I could hear Jamie screaming in agony. I started to notice that he was bleeding. It was then that I realized that the driver had jammed his car keys in between his knuckles, and he was hitting Jamie with them. That's why he was bleeding so much. I opened the door and jumped out of the car, and then pulled Jamie to safety. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye, and probably other places too. We called the police right then and there. When I looked up at the car, it was gone. The driver had taken off. We waited there at the side of the street for the police. Jamie was whimpering. When the cops got there, they called an ambulance. Jamie was rushed to the hospital. We showed our ride record to the police, and later that night, the driver was arrested. I remember feeling really angry and confused that night. Sometimes I think that Jamie deserves to get smacked, and maybe that night was one of those times, but that driver was seriously out of line. I don't know what happened to him earlier in the night, but I can't believe that our ride was the beginning of it. Jamie was released from the hospital after a few hours. Luckily, his injuries were not serious, although the cut above his eye did leave a large scar. It's still visible today, even though it's been over 2 years. He was in a lot of pain, and he was having trouble remembering what happened. We all still use Uber from time to time. I've taken thousands of rides with Uber, and this is by far the worst experience I've had. There are crazy people everywhere, and I don't blame Uber for what happened. Luckily, we managed to get a dangerous guy off the streets.